Thank you, everybody. This is hearing stream 7 dealing with energy and network utilities. It's Monday, the 17th of February, and this is session number 3 on day 1 of hearing. Welcome to everyone in the room. This morning we've heard from 2 Section 42A officers who have read their summary statements, being Mr. Wesley on energy and Ms. Treadaway on network utilities. We managed to finish at 11:30, so we've had a very lengthy lunch break. So hopefully that bodes well for the post-lunch session. Welcome, Mr. Horn and Mr. Schofield. Would you like to just introduce yourselves for the panel? Go first.
Yep, I'm Gary Schofield. I work with Powerco Limited as their Senior Environmental Planner.
And I'm Chris Horn. I'm a planner from Insight, independent planner.
Good to see both of you in person. Thank you for making the effort. We've seen both of you on Teams, I believe, previous hearing. So yeah, good to be in the same room. Now, we have a summary statement from you, Mr. Horn.
Yep.
It provides an update of with for Powerco. Were you planning to take us through that?
I might just whip through that. So that's probably the easiest.
Certainly appreciate the colour coding in terms of the matters that are agreed or not agreed or agreed. That's
and also probably just an overview point is that there's not that much that's still outstanding. So we're largely agreed with Council's 42A and narrowed the issues further. So there's a few points of disagreement, but not substantial. When you look at the submission was fairly lengthy. Also, if I could just go to page 2 of the evidence in chief, summary of the points.
your evidence.
Please. There's a point, 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth bullet point down, rule NUR3 is actually not covered by my evidence. So you can just strike that out.
Hold on for a minute.
Of existing above ground network utilities.
Yeah, I don't think that remained in the final cut, but on that bullet point.
Delete the 4th bullet point.
Yes, please. Fifth, NUR3.
On page 2.
First thing on
But,
and that's it.
Thank you.
I don't think I've ever been the first submitter before, so it's quite exciting. Given how
Keep it that way for you.
yeah, so of the points covered in the evidence, if I just whip through the table on my summary, so the customer connection line definition is agreed between myself and Ms. Treadway. That was including electricity is within the definition. The definition of pole, the definition of pole in the final form of the 42A is the telco NES definition, which is fit for purpose for telco, but doesn't really deal with electricity, which also has rules dealing with the term pole. So I've recommended an amendment to the definition, which I can take you back to if you have questions. But it's just to broaden that beyond the NESTF for other utilities.
Deal with that now then.
Sure.
That was an issue that Ms. Treadaway raised. She was uncertain as to why you couldn't rely on the definition from the NES. But you're saying that's a definition for telcos.
Yes, so I mean the district plan will have to align with that definition insofar as telco networks. So on page 5 on my evidence in chief, it's got the definition as appears in the 42A. And then my suggested edit is on page 6, paragraph 17. So I suppose the telco definition deals with antennas capable of supporting antennas. So obviously, electricity networks' main purpose is to support lines, customer connections and network lines. So yes, technically you might be able to attach an antenna to it. I can see that could cause some confusion with plan interpretation in the future potentially. The other thing is the telco NES definition of pole includes a tower, whereas in the plan, tower is separately defined and has separate standards. So my suggestion was just to say for telco networks, essentially, that's the definition.
Yes.
Otherwise, a structure for supporting network utility lines. There may be other ways to skin the cat.
That would cover poles supporting electricity hardware.
Yes, it would.
Okay. The definition of pole in the NES, is that duplicated or replicated in the National Planning Standards, or is it just
I don't believe so. I haven't actually, I'm sure that Mr. Anderson will give you the answer to that later, but I don't believe it is.
Which would make sense. I mean, we've got a national environmental standard defining a term. Okay. Just straight away, we'll consider that in due course. You can't envisage any unintended consequences of the or otherwise means of structure supporting network utility.
I can't, no.
Okay. Well,
It's used the term line, so I guess if you had a gas network, you couldn't put a pipe.
yeah.
But I don't believe there's a reticulated gas here in the Wairarapa.
And not many that are above ground. Oh, well, on poles anyway. Thank you.
There's a lot above ground, but
Yeah.
we won't go there.
Thank you. That's some food for thought from straight away. Thank you, Mr. Horn.
The next point was definition of upgrade. So
Yes.
it's requesting adding one word, which is the word replacement, just to acknowledge that if you upgrade a network, sometimes you replace the equipment.
Yep.
I can save you traversing this any further if it helps. In a discussion with Treadaway this morning, and the word replacement appears in the objectives and a number of policies already. And we've Ms. Treadaway, you might want to consider revising her position in relation to the word replacement in the definition.
Okay.
And she's open to that. And that certainly is, if it assists, Ms. Treadaway will get in contact to work through any wording on that prior to finalising her ROR.
It occurred to me that the rules already allow structures to be made slightly wider, which implies you're replacing it anyway. So,
yeah.
No, thank you. That probably covers that one off. Then the next point was policy NUP4. So it was on a number of the sub-clauses of the policy, seeking some amendments. There's some points the way, others not. So maybe if we just, the easiest way to deal with that might be to go to page 9 of my evidence in chief. Has got tracks on it that I had.
And we've got Ms. Treadaway's equivalent here, so, yep.
So, well, if we deal with the easiest one first, clause E, I believe Ms. Treadaway agrees with that amendment, so that one's agreed.
I think that's been subject to some evidence from Transparent, so the difference between possible and practical.
Now, if we backtrack to point C, so this is requiring the undergrounding of new network utilities in urban areas. So it is a permitted activity for overhead lines in the general and industrial zone, and it's a permitted activity for customer connections from overhead networks to adjacent customers. So I guess the policy cascade to the rule doesn't require it now. So I had suggested an amendment to reflect that, which had the exceptions. So that's the background to that.
And that's, Mr. Horn, that's the exceptions that allow free pole extension, is that the one?
The customer connection rule allows 3 pole, yes. And general industrial zone, it's just straight out permitted for overhead lines, so.
So the words in bold are a policy cut out to reflect what's in the rules.
Yes, correct.
Are you saying that you don't like the clause D in total, where it's encouraging?
C.
See,
So this is an edit to C. Clause D, so the,
Sorry, I'm one ahead of you, am I?
yep.
Sorry.
That's good. So clause D is essentially outside of urban areas, and the reasoning behind the suggested strikeout is it's actually permitted to have above ground lines in rural zones, which is most of the other areas. So you've got a policy that says encouraging underground, but the reality is most of the network is above ground for reasons that low population density, it simply isn't economic to underground it. So
This is not telling you have to go underground.
No,
It's just saying where possible, we would encourage you to do that for all the benefits that undergrounding does in terms of amenity. So it's not telling you have to.
Yep.
So, yeah, I'm not sure why you would object to that.
fair comment. I think PowerCo's main concern is the expectation it sets with the public. I mean, you might want to talk to that, Gary.
Absolutely. I think where you come into a consenting situation, and I guess if it's a lineal network, so you might pass through many different zones and areas, but your project is to get from point A to point B, and there might be a sensitive area perhaps in the middle, and having a general encouragement to have it underground could apply to potentially the whole project or portions of a project, or could be used as a reason to potentially decline a project. So I guess
Encouraging doesn't give you an out to decline. Encouraging is sort of exactly that. It's not a hard and fast. It's a, if you can, we'd really like you to do that, but it's not a, you must do this.
sure.
And I would suggest to you that most of the public would be supportive of underground structure wherever possible, or encouraging, noting that I live in a rural area. I knew very much what it costs to go underground compared to on power lines, and we did a combination of both, for example.
Right.
So I don't think the public are going to say everything underground, because they won't be able to afford it.
Sure.
So we've got to be practical here, but it is a means by which we're trying to say, hey, if possible, just contemplate this, but we're not going to decline you a resource consent because encouraging doesn't give us a reason to decline. I think you're reading too much into encouragement.
Fair enough.
Possibly.
could I wonder,
It would remove any ambiguity by deleting that, wouldn't it?
Well, it would. I mean, I guess you've got a policy encouraging something that's permitted in the plan. It just seems to me to be a bit of a disconnect. There's probably, you can probably encourage that without it being, like, the policies are supposed to be implemented by rules, essentially. So,
Could you then point to an example in anything where organisations have voluntarily done something without encouragement? Any example.
so, well, no, I can't.
So I think all this is saying is, hey, contemplate this from the amenity perspective for the environment, for people who live out there. And you and I would probably agree that overhead power lines or overhead anything is visually not very nice. We would all love to see everything underground. Would that be a fair comment?
That would be a fair comment.
Yeah. So all this is saying is, wherever possible, we would encourage you to contemplate doing this. If it meets all these other rules and all the costs and all the other things, contemplate it. That's all. And you don't get behaviour change unless you encourage. Do you?
Mr. Horn, I wonder whether there's a compromise situation here where, rather than chuck the baby out with the bathwater and deleting clause D, whether it could be qualified in some manner to reflect what you're saying and what Councillor Plym is saying about where possible, in the same way that some of the other clauses have been qualified, such as E and F.
Yeah, I mean, it would be, if it was possible, I think it would be practicable, but I see Mr. Scholefield's point that if you're applying for a project that has a whole lot of elements, including some above ground bits, and they, for practicality reasons, decide not to underground it, are they going to cop heap on this policy as it stands?
I wait for those parts of the linear development where it's permitted.
Yeah.
Certainly, where they're seeking a consent to go overhead, those parts of the linear development that are a consent required, the policy would be relevant. How much weight put on it, I guess, is the debate. What's the chapeau to the policy? Manage the adverse effects by encouraging and encouraging, not requiring, as in C.
Yep.
Well, okay, it looks like we've still got a contest there. Why don't you and Treadaway reflect on that? And if your current position is you prefer to see clause D deleted in its entirety, all I'm doing is inviting you to maybe suggest on a without prejudice basis what the wording might look like if it was qualified.
No, happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And like I acknowledge your point too. So.
Okay, back to the table.
So now we're down to clause F.
We delete clause C, because I know we kind of, Councillor Plummer jumped ahead to D.
Oh,
So we were
yes.
still under
C.
clause C, where page 9 of your evidence.
So this was the carve out for the rules permitted to make sure the policy cascade to the rules.
That's now back in Mr. Treadaway's court, I think, to consider whether that policy carve out is appropriate.
So clause F then. So the submission sought to delete clause F. The primary concern is that when you have policies saying integrate network utilities essentially with existing built form, there's an implication that it should be of a scale similar to what a zone provides for. And obviously, the whole reason plans have separate network utility sections is they're different. They have functional and operational requirements where they don't look like a house or a shop, they look like a network utility. They may have to be taller to achieve their function. And so the clause is notified certainly was a concern that was indicating that network utilities might have to look more like the activities in the zones in which they need to locate. Now, Ms. Treadaway's 42A certainly, 42A reply certainly improves that clause with adding the qualifier where practicable. So that does take a lot of heat out of that clause. I wonder if that further heat could be taken out of it by bringing in the words and acknowledging functional and operational requirements as part of that practicality. And then I think that makes that clause more sort of palatable in terms of.
In a similar way to which clause C.
Yes.
Those terms.
Yeah.
Is it technological and operational, or is it functional?
It's probably functional and operational. I mean, functional, I believe, really brings in technical, whereas operational is you may have to get from point A to point B, and that's your operational requirement.
Okay. Or to some. Sorry, any questions?
Yeah, I'm a little bit sympathetic with you on this one because I don't quite understand what sensitive design means. So how does that apply to a utility?
Yeah, it was a risk. So it's got to look like a house or.
Yeah. That's the examples you gave of the house and the utility. That's fantastic, and that would be in the realm of where I would say encourage. But when you say requiring sensitive design, that adds a much greater compliance requirement by those words of requiring. And then sensitive design, I would suggest, is how wide is this book going to be? Who's going to decide whether it's sensitive or not?
Yes.
We understand your position, Mr. Horn. Can we invite you to, on a without prejudice basis, to provide some wording that references the function and operational? And we'll ask Ms. Treadaway to consider that. But like all these suggestions, if a earlier conversation with Ms. Treadaway might resolve things or assist in your drafting, please avail yourself of that.
Sure, no problem. And then do you envisage so that I'll email the committee
No.
secretary or?
Oh, the committee secretary, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It needs to be done in time for Ms. Treadaway to finish her right of reply, which will be 3 weeks on the close of the hearings. We could maybe get onto that later in the week. Have any discussions that you need. That will give her enough time to address that in her right of reply.
Should I do that direct or via Ruth?
The discussions,
Yes,
you can go straight to Ms. Treadaway.
thank you.
We're not that overly, I mean, I think I said right from the start, don't rely on directions from the panel necessarily. Just get on the blower if you think there's a without prejudice conversation to be had.
Okay, thank you.
Makes our job a lot easier. Okay, back to the table now.
So we're now on page 2 and we're looking at 6 and 15, which is essentially indoor and outdoor substations.
Had a long conversation about this morning, but
So I've belligerently beaten Mr. Schofield with a large stick about pursuing more flexibility for outdoor substations. So I wasn't prepared to back him on that one. However, I'd be interested just to get an update on the discussions if they're relevant to what I'm about to say, if that's possible.
I guess what the 6 and 15, isn't it?
Yes.
Yep.
Can I just ask a question on that in the 20 square metres? Are you aware that in the operative district plan, it's actually currently 10 square metre footprint?
No, I'm not.
So effectively the PDP is doubling what is already in the operative plan. I don't know if you were aware of that.
No, I wasn't. I think Mr. Schofield would confirm though that either way, nothing's probably going to be that small.
So a modern substation would have a switch room building, probably 150 to 200 square metres at least. So we're not going to comply either way.
Okay. Well, okay, that might make what I'm about to say redundant, but I'll say it anyway. Panel had some sympathy for the 20 square metre limitation being restrictive in rule 6 thing. 15, isn't it? 15.
6 is the outdoor, 15 is the indoor.
Yeah, for the indoor in rule 15 under clause 1B. At the same time, we're a little bit concerned about just deferring to the zone rules, which don't have a floor space limitation directly. By default, it would, through site coverage, setbacks, recession plane, perhaps indirectly set a limit, but we're very reluctant to just default to those. And we were wondering whether there was some middle ground between the 20 square metres and that open-ended limit on the zone rules. And we were going to ask you functionally, what's the typical floor space requirement? You've just given it to us, 150 to 200 square metres.
I mean, that might work still for lower amenity, commercial, industrial, even rural, where buildings of large scale have no urban design controls. You can have a warehouse, you can have a big barn. I acknowledge residential areas are more sensitive.
I mean, the rule is all zones at this stage.
Yeah.
So if you can differentiate between zones and break down the rule within the scope of the mission, be of assistance, I'm sure.
So that sounds like another homework one for us to come back to you on that.
I mean, from the policy perspective, we're conscious of P4 and what it's trying to do. Minimise, I'll just correct the wording, manage the adverse facilities by controlling the height, bulk, and location of network utilities. So, mitigating the adverse visual effects. Well, we discussed the adverse about the sensitive design, but in terms of policy A, we would expect to see a metric. If it wasn't 20 square metres, something else, not an open-ended provision that refers to the zone rule.
Okay, thank you. We'll go away and together and
Sure.
back with a suggestion.
And of course, all of these discussions are made on or without prejudice basis. We're just getting back.
Understood.
I'll be travelling this morning, so you probably didn't have the opportunity to listen to the very intriguing discussion we had on all these matters.
You would be correct. I did not. Okay, so now we move on to rule RU10, which is heights and footprints for minor utility structures, and that would appear to be agreed. The next point is rule NUR15 again, but it's about a different issue. It's setbacks and roads for network utility equipment, and it's kind of linked to standard NUS2, which is also the permitted activity standard for buildings and structures where, from my reading of it, if you're in the road, the adjacent zone setback, for example, still applies. And so if you had permitted lines or a permitted transformer in the road reserve in a zone where it's permitted, the setback might put you in the middle of the traffic lanes.
Yes, and Councillor Plummer, very alive to that. And Councillor, do you want to?
Yeah, so we've asked the officers to go back and have a look at what the NZTA rules are around what can be inside the road corridors, because district councils are also governed by those rules. So it's a little bit of work to do there. And we're very aware that NZTA is going down the line of removing everything out of the road corridor in future. So that may well have an effect on how we approach this.
Certainly, Mr. Scholefield's experience with electricity and mine working for telco clients is the road controlling authorities more often than not don't want you out in the middle of the berm or on the footpath, actually want you on the boundary. So often the local authority is the road controlling authority, and you can sort of have planning, regulatory and road controlling functions working at odds.
Well, if you look at the new NZTA rules around hazards within the road corridor, that is having a direct impact on road speeds. And so they assess all those things, whether it be power lines, utility boxes, anything, and they will use utility as an excuse to argue that the road speeds should be reduced. That has a direct impact on how road speeds are set in district council environments as well. So we just need to make sure that we're within the rules of the ASC, and that will probably decide the outcome on this.
I'd guess, without knowing the answer, that the Electricity Act would give you a right of tenure.
Yeah, under the Electricity Act, we do have a right to locate on the road subject to reasonable conditions, obviously. So, it goes.
So doesn't that apply though to existing, not new?
Wouldn't apply.
Still go through consent.
So anything new would have to go through the corridor access request, and the roading manager, be it NZTA or the council roading department, would put their reasonable conditions against that. Existing stuff is allowed to remain there, and that road controlling authority can request it be moved at their cost. So,
but it's you've got a right of tenure. You don't have to get a lease or a loan.
No. Yeah. No, but they are trying to move things out of the corridor. Safety.
Yep.
Not only just for the roading, but also your staff that are working on those environments.
Would depend a bit on how wide the road might be.
Oh, for sure.
The boom.
Yeah.
So Mr. Horn, just going to your relief that you've added an exclusion for network utility structures like B.
I'm just
Things.
I'm just going to find myself in my own evidence.
On your,
Thank you very much. So I think in terms of use of road space, forcing stuff 3 metres off the boundary, I think would be a negative for the functionality of the road corridor. I know that it's an amenity suggestion to do that.
That would apply to both poles, but also lower level equipment like transformers or switch units as well.
It's unforgiving as poles.
Well, yep, they are certainly if you.
So that's why you want them away from the traffic lane.
Yeah.
So you don't hit them.
If the panel was of a mind to adopt the relief in 15(1)(c) and add in the words in bold, what is that? What relationship, if any, does that have with NUS 2? Which
S2. So this is
the outside road reserve S2.
no. So R15 is standards for equipment. S2 is permitted activity standards for all permitted utilities.
Yes.
Whereas R15 is a specific enabling rule for essentially above ground utilities not otherwise provided for another rule. So that's a rule, but not a standard.
Provided for any other rule.
So the S2, the point with S2, for example, is overhead lines and transformers are permitted in roads in an industrial zone, but to comply, you would have to sit them in some instances 10 metres off the boundary to meet the setback, which would be right in the middle of the traffic lane.
So is Powerco submitted on S2?
Yes.
Okay, and you need to deal with that then.
That was it's the next point, and there's kind of crossover between them.
Okay.
So then there's another relief point on page 14.
Yes. Oh, same. Lines and structures. Okay. So similar approach. Similar approach to R15.
There, I just draw your attention to that relief in paragraph 58 as there is a comma. So that's overhead lines in all instances where they're permitted, because you might have a customer feed into a property where you're not going to be realistically able to set it, if it's in the driveway 10 metres off the boundary.
That excluding overhead lines, comma.
Yes,
and structures located in roads.
Okay, so overhead lines regardless of where they're located.
where they're permitted.
Yeah.
So it's only permitted activity standard. In planning, the comma's always important. No. And that's all the outstanding points there. So Mr. Schofield had provided some images of, which I attached on page 3 of the summary of substation versus house on the same street in Tauranga, but appears we've already debated at this point. So
Had conversations around that.
Yeah, and we acknowledge that you're not pursuing the matter on the outdoor substation.
Correct.
So, but that-
Mr. Schofield would like to. However, I'm the independent planner.
Oh, no.
Okay.
just,
We don't just do what we're told always.
well, can we have that in writing, please? Period.
So that is the outdoor substation relief.
Well,
NU6, I believe.
just for posterity.
So what you wanted in writing was that the planner doesn't always do what the client.
Just ask a random question. But When it comes to erecting towers and poles, the aviation authority come and do you have you got rules and height and
Yes, funnily enough, I'm just doing a Radio New Zealand mast in Auckland, and so large aerodromes have, normally the district plan has approach slopes and horizontal and conical surfaces, and you're not allowed to go through them. And if you need to go through them, you need the permission of the designation, the that's plan, you'd need resource consent. Where it gets tricky is when you're at small aerodromes in regional areas, sometimes they're not on the plan. They still exist. CAA will still have controls, but you've got to kind of know to look for them.
This is a question that will we also be putting to the Meridian witness, but I think what the Commissioner was thinking was masts well away from aerodromes where the CAA regulations require some form of lighting or to alert for very high masts.
Yes.
Such as meteorological testing masts.
Yep. So the Radio New Zealand one I'm involved in too. They're both having to put nav lights on them.
Yep.
But as to how you know when you have to go and ask, it's not going to be an issue for a 9 or 10 metre electricity pole on the road. Could be an issue for my telco colleagues behind me if they did something very tall on a hill. But what the trigger is, I actually, in all honesty, don't know.
It must be something on the CAA.
Yes, it will be. Like in the Radio New Zealand thing, they knew they had to get it. How they knew, I actually don't know the answer, but it's probably if you're over a certain height. Or
For our purposes of this forum, it's something that we can rely on in terms of being covered by a regulation.
yes.
District plan.
There are definitely other regulations, and they're quite detailed. They get down into it have to be low or medium or high intensity, and if it has to flash. And
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sculptor, Mr. Horn. I'm slightly over time.
That was really helpful
That
though.
was helpful. And but I think we've dealt with some of the issues that will be covered by the telcos and Meridian and Genesis. That's useful. Thank you for coming along.
Cheers. Thank you. Should hang. Yeah.
You're welcome. I'll just make sure I've always got them up.
Mr. Anderson.
It's unforgiving as a bloody powerful. It's unforgiving as a. Right, there you go.
very helpful.
Yes.
Welcome all three. We'll get you to, for the record, to introduce yourselves.
Yes, certainly. Kia ora. I'm Tom Anderson. I'm an independent planner from Insight. It's been engaged by the telecommunication companies for the Wairarapa proposed district plan. And as you'll see from the submission and the evidence, that includes Chorus, who are represented today by Andrew Cantor on my right, Park, who are represented by Graham McCarrison at the end of the table, as well as 40 South and Connexa, who are tower companies who aren't with us.
Welcome all three. And I think we've said this at previous hearings. We appreciate the joint approach by the telcos on these matters.
Problem.
Likewise, Mr. Anderson, you've done a similar approach to Mr. Horn in terms of identifying areas that are in agreement and disagreement. Hand over to you and you can take us through that.
And as you'll see, it's 50-50. 8 submission points for that remain in contention and 4 where there is agreement. So I'll focus on those remain in contention. And the first one of those is the wording and policies. Objective 2 and policies 4 and 5.
Yes.
Yeah, I've sought in my evidence that the recognition of the practicabilities around avoiding, remedying and mitigating the adverse effects of network are included in those provisions. And so my example given was that a pole which can be conceived of having visual effects has to be of that size in order to provide the service it requires, and ultimately that by avoiding, remedying or mitigating that adverse effect of adverse visual effect could result in no service in a particular area. Also noted an error in the relief requested to, in your paragraph 4, that's at page 3 of my summary statement. So we've updated to reflect that copy and paste error.
Just one,
Yeah,
one at a time, Mike. Yes.
Yeah.
So can I ask you a question on two?
Sure, let's turn to that.
When it says well recognising, isn't that doing exactly what you're asking? So we are trying to avoid, remedy or mitigate, but we are recognising the functional need and the positive effects. Doesn't that do exactly what you're suggesting?
I have thought about that, and I'm not overly concerned about objective 2. I think the practicability is a recognition that adds to that, but I think there is a pathway in that exact situation.
It's redundant words.
So it could be redundant words, but the practicability, I think, is also a well understood resource management term about what it actually means. So
if the objective is setting the end goal about avoiding, remedying or mitigating the adverse effects of network utilities, policies 4 and 5 then could do the heavy lifting and saying how that's achieved,
that's right.
and perhaps then introducing the concepts of practicability.
Yes.
Would you accept that?
I agree.
We want to talk about the particular changes to policy 4 that you're.
It's the removal of the in policy 4B of while recognising there are technological or operational constraints when talking about the recognised standards or guidelines of noise, vibration, radio frequency, and electric and magnetic fields. That doesn't need to be there, so it can be deleted.
Okay. Is that was your original relief, was it?
That was in my evidence.
Yes.
Page 8 of my evidence, Chief.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Yep. And what about A?
No changes there. Seeking that, continue to seek the evidence as sought and the where practicable without compromising the functional need for the proposed activity.
Do you think that the word where practical still puts the onus upon you to prove that it's not practical in terms of any resource consent that you might apply for or whatever?
Absolutely, that's where that plays out.
Yeah, so comfortable with that. Want to make sure the onus is still on the right side of it.
That would be the key focus of any resource consent application.
Yeah.
Why in that particular location? Why that height? Yeah.
Mr. Hans, why are the words after where practical necessary in both of those instances, A and F?
Sorry, Mr. McMonkey.
Why are the words without compromising the functional need of the proposed network utility necessary in addition to the words where practical? Ms. Fedaway has accepted the words to the extent in clause F. He may also be open to change clause A. We haven't really discussed that.
I guess that's explaining what the practicability is, so that the focus is still on ensuring why that network utility is there. So that's putting a bottom line in my abilities are.
And there's no other mention in that policy 4 about functional need, because there.
Isn't that inherent in objective 2 anyway? The fact that it's written in the objective of that with the positive effects and the functional need and operational, that's applied anyway in the objective. So
That's right. So
it's reading exactly what's already there in the objective, because the policies and rules are to give effect to that objective.
that's right.
So you don't need those extra.
I think they could be useful for interpretation. So Otherwise, it's you're going back to up another level. And as Mr. McMahon was saying, the policy really is saying how the objective should be implemented.
Okay. We'll leave that with Ms. Treadaway to consider. But again, as I said to Mr. Horn, if you and Ms. Treadaway see some benefit in having a discussion offline, by all means, please do so.
Will do.
And just do that perhaps earlier rather than later. That would be useful. Hey, where does that take us to?
Takes us.
Paragraph 10.
Yes. So with regard to rules 4, 5 and 11, I thought that the standards which these rules are subject to should be explicit
Yes.
in the rules. And I've given an example. There are situations where I can see confusion or disagreement between a network utility provider and council as to what relevant standards are. So by being specific in those rules as to what standards apply, it takes away that ambiguity or potential argument at consent or compliance time as to why a standard does not apply or why it is not being considered as relevant.
Yes, I must admit I have some sympathy for that. Require a little bit of work because that performance standard is repeated in a number of rules.
It is.
But it would be simply a matter of listing the standards, wouldn't it, in each case, which some of them, and they'll be different each time, presumably.
That's right. There might be some that could be consistent each time, and that would take a sort of detailed analysis of all the rules and matching them up. It's an exercise I've been through on other plans, but
certainly on a without prejudice basis, we would encourage you and Ms. Treadaway to at least identify those relevant standards, sorry, and then Ms. Treadaway to consider whether it's appropriate or not. Having regard to efficiency and effectiveness of those specific rules, but
yeah, there's a little trigger in my mind, I guess, as well around the scope in terms of I've submitted on, I think it's rules 4, 5 and 11, and that issue could play out in other
yes,
as well that Ms. Treadaway might want to consider without my input, if that's what the panel is of mind.
the wording at the moment is quite broad, and it says relevant standards, which is quite open.
Yeah.
It talks about all network utility standards. That's what it says.
Yes.
Some of those won't be relevant, obviously.
That's right. Yeah. So electric and magnetic fields is one that immediately springs to mind, and that's not relevant to telecommunications, but on the face of it, it may be considered relevant from either a compliance officer or something's been sent when you've applied for a resource consent, and then you're going through an exercise of explaining why not.
I think, okay, let's break this down again. I think identifying actually the standards that are appropriate, that's the first exercise, and then Ms. Redway can decide whether she wants to run what her recommendation is.
Okay, happy to do so.
Wouldn't you end up in the, regardless of which way this plays out, you're going to end up in the same boat with a consent authority going, oh, we think this one might be relative, and you're going to go, that one's not in this case, or whatever.
Well,
it's going to be that discussion.
not necessarily, not if the plan's prescriptive, and that's what we're seeking here. That the plan prescribes that for NU Rule 4, that compliance is achieved with network utility standard NUS 1 rather than, and then it's abundantly clear to all parties, whether it be the consent.
But are there standards within your specific standards that won't apply to everything you do? Some things will apply and some things won't, depending on the activity you're undertaking. They won't be relevant.
Yes, I
There's
think
ways of removing the word relevant.
everyone's accepting that, I think.
It just worries me that you get too prescriptive. You might end up in the exact opposite place where you want to be.
So it's a
I think that's where the work that runs directed around sitting down and going through the standards, and it's a process I went through for another plan I was working on, but as the 42A officer, to link all of those standards and rules together to give that precision, to ensure that what the activity is linked to the appropriate standards for that activity.
I guess something that Ms. Treadaway will need to consider is scope. You've indicated
That's right.
discussion relates to 3 rules, maybe more. Then question is whether we could use clause 16 to actually attack other rules. And we'll invite Mr. Wesney to have a view on that also in terms of his wider overview of the plan. But certainly the more prescriptive we can be in terms of permitted activities, the better, because we don't want to have the debate at a later stage, so long as we're not creating an unfair situation for any party and nominating particular standards. Yep. Okay. A little bit of work there. Yeah, the sooner you tackle that, better.
Certainly.
Okay.
Turning to building footprints, which in the discussion between the panel and Mr. Horn, and heard with my colleagues as well around building size that particularly chorus with exchanges would require. I accept that a 20 square was appropriate. There's a character and amenity, a strong character and amenity aspect to those, and therefore control is appropriate. We had a similar issue at a hearing last week for the Timaru district plan, where I think it was 50 square metres was the building footprint, and as we're driving through the South Canterbury area on our way back to Christchurch, you see in the rural zone large, was industrial buildings on the edge of town, large sheds in the rural area, and thinking, well, a 300 square metre.
That's of one south of Christchurch.
That is it's significant, some of them are, phenomenal, and so comparing the effects of those with what a 300 square metre telephone exchange would have, it wouldn't be noticeable in my opinion. Nothing different to what's the existing character and amenity of those more generous types. So noting the point raised around settling on a quantum for the footprint rather than relying on the zone standards, I think a good course of action, should the panel be open to it, would be for Ms. Treadaway, Mr. Horn and myself to all discuss that point.
There was some conversation around here before you guys arrived that the amenity of this is quite critical. So the idea of building a concrete bunker, for example, doesn't fit within the amenity of an area where you might be doing this. And the examples that we've seen with the house compared to that's nice. But how do we put that into the rules that you have to take into account the amenity of the environment of which you're proposing to do these builds?
Yeah, I think that's where the 20 square metre provision can work, or having a provision can work, because in the residential zones, had to build a new exchange. That opens up that conversation as to how would you mitigate the effect of a larger building footprint. The question then becomes, in other zones where the character and amenity is more generous, it's not as prescriptive, is it appropriate that we require?
I'll give you a practical example of what's happened in South Wairarapa. When Chippy was on council with me, we went down the line of those colour coordinated rubbish bins, the recycling bins, and they were being put on the side of the street in the heritage zone. Well, that created a storm and a big storm, as you can imagine, because these things weren't designed in the 1880s. And so that's the sort of thing I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think that's entirely appropriate to control
how you would fit your facilities in a small 20 square metre that fits within the environment in which you're doing it, so it doesn't look out of place.
Yeah, I think the first, agreed. I think that's in those zones where there's really tight.
But how could we put those rules in here so that, because if we didn't do that, then tomorrow it might be a concrete bunker if we don't have that sort of guiding principles around things.
I think without changing the activity status, focus has to be on the size, the standard, the size, because otherwise we need to get into a design interference type control, which would involve at the very least controlled activity or restricted discretionary.
And as a the top of my head here, I haven't got the in front of me, how the land, heritage and network utilities, but I'm certain the heritage provisions by Mr. Weston to be able to help
Overlay.
trump the building. So it wouldn't be a permitted activity. The 20 square metres wouldn't apply
So
heritage.
what we've got is we've got the plan notified at 20 metres. We've got a submission seeking zone standards. So the scope's quite wide.
Right.
So, but we do want to see a nuanced approach between the different zones. And if it's appropriate to rely on the zone standards for a particular zone, then that's within scope. If it's more appropriate to have a specified metric for a more sensitive zone, such as the residential, you're happy with 20 metres. Mr. Horn has indicated that his client's not particularly happy with 20 metres.
Yeah, my client, if they're happy or not, I think 20 square.
And you've chucked out the 50 square metres for Timaru, or you mentioned the 50 square metres. So, and some analysis of how other district, there's a group of 5 plans that are going through the same process. I think Waimakariri, Timaru, West Coast, Northland. The gang of 5, I think. Apia.
Yeah.
All those sort of second generation. Are they second generation or third generation?
They're all second.
Yeah.
So could I just ask a question? So around commercial industrial.
Yep.
What's the sensitivity toward utility buildings and why? Basically, it's just, I kind of struggle with the concept that any other activity other than utilities can build whatever they like. And yet we're expected to have a very small footprint
Sure.
for some perceived environmental impact, which if it's noise and all of those, they're controlled by different rules. For radio emissions and so forth, they're controlled by national standards and so forth. So what?
I guess it's not really for me to answer that.
Oh, no, it's just
I'll have a bash at it.
have a conversation around it. It's kind of understanding.
Someone said earlier when I was talking that this isn't about design and appearance, it's about size. And so the notified plan in terms of Section 32 has adopted a low threshold to avoid, as an efficient and effective way to really control design and appearance without actually having a high level consent. Now, rightly or wrongly, that's the approach that's been taken. The sensitivity of industrial zones is obviously less than a commercial zone, and particularly bearing in mind you've got 3 different commercial zones. You've got the town centre, the neighbourhood centre, and the mixed use zone. I think each 3 of those will have different sensitivities also. So that's something that Mr. Anderson and Ms. Treadaway are going to have to take into account if Ms. Treadaway is going to move from the 20 metres. And
I guess to answer your question, that the pressure is going to be back on you guys to design a box that's going to fit in those zones, that's going to fit the environment. I mean, I know of councils that have gone, people have gone around and painted them and done floral arrangements on them. So, I don't know.
just out of interest,
Occurring in Great Town as we speak.
in terms of small telephone exchanges, these local network exchanges are quite small now, aren't they?
They can be, it depends on whether they need to have backup power generation, and we've sort of built within the years. The smaller one without power generation was about 100 square metres.
Yes.
The larger one bigger than that, and we're encouraged by noise constraints to put the generators within inside the building, and that takes up as well as some diesel storage and things.
Generally, they are these new smaller facilities associated with large developments to service those developments, whether they're residential or industrial.
Placements have existed. We're moving some out of floodplains, that sort of thing.
But are you building new telephone exchanges in the sense that we used to know them in the
there are
60s and 80s?
There are plans for some where there's becoming sort of oversubscribed, if you like.
On new sites?
But new development.
Yeah. Okay.
But the equipment, the actual telecommunications equipment footprint needed inside, and we expect to get smaller as we phase out the copper network.
I've been in some of the old double brick telephone exchanges in Christchurch.
Some of them are like museums.
Okay, well, is that, Mr. Anderson, is that clear? Do you think you've got enough to go on and straight away?
I think it's very clear, thank you.
Okay. Where are we now?
Final point, which is pole heights under standard 1.
Yes.
So I sought an additional 5 metres of height be permitted for co-location of 2 or more telecommunication network providers on a single pole, which is an effort to encourage co-location, and that's something we're seeing more and more of through the as I mentioned earlier, 40 South and Connexa, where I think it's a better outcome where there is a single pole hosting 2 or more network providers rather than what has historically occurred where there's 2 or 3 poles in a really close proximity, which just adds, I guess, that visual clutter to an area. So the RMA way around that is to permit additional height for the 5 metres. And I had some commentary in my evidence in chief around, from my experience, it's not necessarily the height of the pole that causes angst from some in the community. It's whether a pole is there or not. And a couple of the more recent examples are permitted activity or controlled activities around the country where you've been strong pushback from members of the community, yet from a resource management perspective, it's a fait accompli given the activity status of that. So I've also included the 5 metre height as a common permitted activity provision around the country, and I've noted Plymouth, Wellington and Stelwyn proposed plans where that provision's included, just to name a few of the examples. The other aspect of pole height for standard 1 is seeking 35 metres permitted for rural. There's an interplay between the NESTF and the district plan here. And there's one way of explaining it. I've said that National Environmental Standard for Telecommunications is almost a document written to work alongside district plans, whereby it sets permitted standards and relies on the district plan to set the other activity statuses. What is the under the National Environmental Standard? So it has a permitted height of 25 metres for new poles in rural areas. If the PDP were to set 35 metres as permitted activity for poles, it would become a controlled activity under the National Environmental Standard, so it would still require a resource consent. Reflecting on that now, an alternative might be that standard 1 or a rule could be included in the plan that sets 35 metres as a controlled activity to provide that alignment, but in reality, that alignment already exists through the mechanism in regulations 14 and this regulation 14 of the NES. And that's where I can conclude today's presentation, noting that I listened on again with interest around the definition of pole, and noting I've no issues with the Mr. Vaughan's bolt-on definition to clarify the difference between telecommunications and electricity.
And just for completeness, the definition of tower that's been suggested in relation to energy matters, it doesn't concern you at all.
I think I might have suggested that definition.
Okay.
But it doesn't concern me, no.
So if it did concern.
Definition.
This,
Yes, the last sentence in that definition is only applicable to electricity. Mr. Treadaway thought that possibly delete that.
yeah. The crux of this whole issue is that the NES sets the definition and says a pole is a tower. It's not helpful.
I've always preferred the term support structure.
Yeah, which is sometimes found in the definition of line. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
But remembering in rural zones, there is a tower dimension.
Yeah.
And that's the only place it's used in the NES.
that's right, 6 metres.
Yeah.
Just for clarity then, we go to standard one.
Certainly.
Height for towers under the misways, statement is 15 metres. In residential, for poles, it's 15 metres or 5 metres above the permitted height standard. But you're suggesting that the starting point should be 20 metres. Is that what you're saying? Or for two? Sorry,
Plus 5 metres from the permitted
four.
standard.
Well, yeah.
Is it 12 metres from, sorry, is it plus 5 from the 15? Or that you're relieved?
Which zone?
In the residential zone?
zone.
Yeah, 5 metres above the 15 or I've thought 17.
Okay, and the same with commercial, 5 metres above 20 metres for two or more,
That's right. Yes.
and 35 metres in the rural zone with 5 metres for two or more.
Yeah, also. Yeah.
Okay, but you accept that will put the district plan slightly at odds with the NES. You'll need a consent as a controlled activity.
It relies back on that regulation 14 of the NES to create a controlled activity.
Okay, and a possible solution would to make the 35 metres a controlled activity in the district plan.
That is a solution. I don't think it's the only solution. I'm comfortable with having 35 metres as permitted, given that mechanism is existent in the NES.
Again, I'd just encourage you and Ms. Treadaway, but to its extent that it's relevant to Mr. Horn to get together on those matters.
I've just got a question. Yeah, thank you. The extra 5 metres on a pole that's got more than one communicator or whatever you call them, is that to add room for more infrastructure from the second provider on that pole?
That's right. So my understanding, and Mr. Harrison now able to help here, but each utility provider, each telecommunications provider has to have its own antenna. And to go higher is what is required. Going lower, I understand, to lessens the coverage. So it gets back into the practicability. Is it?
Yeah.
So reduces the height of the radio frequency lower to the ground. So brief summary.
That's it. And so when you got two operators, you obviously got cumulative radio emissions.
Yeah.
In terms of fairness, it just provides a more reasonable opportunity potentially for operators to at least have similar footprints, radio coverage footprints to service customers. In bigger areas where a head frame would be, then this will go higher but together on a head frame, basically. In urban areas tend not to have the ability to put a head frame, so they go one above each other.
Yeah. Does that also include the lightning rod on top, that 35 metres, or is that extra?
So that be excluded. So it's excluded already in a number of the zones, and I've sought relief to make sure it's excluded in the rural as well.
Yeah, primarily just the narrowness of the rod itself and its functional. Well, to have them.
12 millimetres, I think, is the diameter typically of a lightning rod, so very difficult to discern. Looking at.
And a lot shorter than originally. They used to be over a metre or so. They're kind of quite short now. Kind of.
Thank you.
Okay. Other questions of? Thank you very much, all three of you.
Next Monday.
Really interesting.
Remotely.
Thanks. Opposite the
Okay, we're running slightly behind time, so the next emitter is Genesis Energy. We have Mr. Richard Matthews online. Welcome, Mr. Matthews.
Thank you for that.
Good afternoon.
Apologies for being online rather than in person. I had intended to be there in person, but something came up that meant I couldn't make it from one end of the country to the other in the time allowed.
That's okay. We're running even now. We're slightly late and you're remote, so. You can hear us okay, Mr. Matthews?
I can hear you okay, yes.
Good. Well, did you manage to fit in on any of the session this morning, Mr. Matthews?
No, I didn't, unfortunately. That was the nature of the problem that I had getting there, was that I was tied up elsewhere as well.
Okay, fine. We're in your hands. How do you want, have you got, you didn't have a summary statement, did you?
I didn't have a summary statement. I guess I can be extremely brief in where I'm coming from. And of course, that may be subject to anything that happened this morning. But I guess all I wanted to do today was just to make it abundantly clear that Genesis is not seeking a free rein for renewable energy activities, but rather is looking at the provisions to appropriately give consideration to those things, those matters. And I guess where they were opposing a non-complying activity status, it was simply to say, why non-complying when you can actually do everything that you need to under a consent application for a discretionary activity as well, that you can apply the same rules. So yeah, just not open free rein. I think I can also say that that Genesis himself, as their planning expert, support in large part the provisions in the proposed plan and certainly the modifications that have been made through the 42A report. There's a relatively few outstanding matters. I think I've spoken with Ms. Foster for Meridian Energy to try and come up with some wording for some of those provisions. And in that regard, I've been very supportive of the wording that she has promoted in her evidence. So I don't have any other matters to add to that. I would be very supportive of some further discussion on the upgrading provision status rule. I understand that Ms. Foster or Meridian has proposed a permitted activity rule for upgrading of large-scale wind generation or renewable generation activities. I think that's appropriate when you look at what upgrading can actually entail. It may just simply be changing a rotor blade from a straight one to one that's got a kink in the end of it would be regarded as an upgrading activity. So we'd like to see some provision for that sort of thing to be included in the rules. And again, I think Ms. Foster has been talking to the 42A report writer to try and cover that off. And I think that's about all I can say at this stage, and open to questions.
Okay, I'll just see if anyone has any for you, Mr. Matthews.
Hi, Mr. Matthews, Alistair Plymouth here. Thank you for joining us today. I just want to talk to you, and obviously Ms. Fletcher's going to listen very clearly about these because the same questions are coming to you. Ms. Foster, sorry. The upgrading that you're talking about, how do you see that upgrading includes perhaps a 50% increase in surface area or 150 metre increase in tower height or moving to the edge of a consented field or whatever as an upgrade?
I guess it goes back to, in that instance, what you're talking about is specifically related to wind generation facilities, and it becomes a question of what is now available in the marketplace. And I'll use an example of a Wairarapa wind farm. The Hanui wind farm was built mid-1990s, first consented and built in the mid-1990s, upgraded in the early 2000s. those turbines are wearing out and require refurbishment, upgrading, whatever is available. Simply put, the turbines that were used back in the 1990s and early 2000s are not available today. So any upgrading that happens at Haunui will be of a different turbine, and that might mean using the full extent of the consented envelope, because particularly for the second stage there, it might mean going for higher turbine heights because that's what's available now, and the ultimate end result of that might be, for example, the same number of turbines, but quite a bit higher, modified in location slightly because they are different dimensions, and producing quite a bit more electricity, but still a wind farm in the same location.
So would you consider then that, using Haunui as an example, because I remember when that went through, that there was all sorts of conversations about tower height and so on, and when the consent was issued, conditions were imposed upon tower heights, as you probably would remember. If you increase that height by 50%, are you suggesting that that would still be within the realms of what the original consent was granted for?
Certainly, I recollect the Haunui consenting. You may be familiar. I did the resource consent for the extension works there back in whenever it was, 2000. My memory's not quite good on the date. And yes, tower height was an issue, partly because there is in one part of the wind farm there was an airstrip. I also know that the land ownership has changed in that location as well since that time, and the person who opposed the wind farm height and so on at the time is now owns the or subsequently owned. I haven't checked recently as to whether he owns the land still, but subsequently purchased the land there. Now, is it within the original scope? It's still a wind farm in that site. There would still have to be consideration given to the effect of that activity. So yeah, I'd agree that perhaps in that instance there could be a situation where you're saying that actually it's not entirely permitted upgrade in that instance. And I guess therein lies the difficulty in these rules that we have, and that in site-specific situations there may be considerations that differ. Is that a requirement then for a full discretionary activity consent? Perhaps not. Perhaps there's a way of actually having an intermediate way of just considering the effect of that particular change in that situation, so restricted discretionary.
I suppose if there were conditions put on a consent originally, and then you want to, under the terms of upgrading, exceed those conditions, that triggers questions, I would have thought, as to whether that is an upgrade or a new consent.
Or a change of conditions to the consent, yes.
Yes, Mr. Matthews, I mean, section 127 then would need to be satisfied to make sure that was a fair and just variation and met those tests. But
yes,
putting that to one side, what I can tell you and Ms. Foster, so that we can sort of tiptoeing around this issue, panels had a discussion about this on the lunch adjournment. We are highly unlikely to adopt the relief of the permitted activity with the metrics as listed in the submission by Meridian and Genesis. We'd prefer, if we weren't going to run with the discretionary activity rule, we'd prefer to look at some alternatives to that, which might involve either of option A, revised metrics that are less enabling, for want of a better term, or a revised activity status. And you just touched on that earlier when you mentioned restricted discretionary. So we've mentioned this to Mr. Wesley. So I don't want you to leave here today thinking that that the relief that's suggested with permitted activity subject to those 4 standards is going to get any sort of traction. We're as a panel, we're very, very firm that we don't have an appetite for that. We don't think that's appropriate. It might be efficient, but we don't think it's effective in managing effect. So I hope you don't mind me giving you that headline news now, but we are open to considering alternatives that might be equally as efficient, but or still efficient, but more effective in managing effects. And we're very clear what the policy direction is here on that. So what we're going to do is suggest that you, Ms. Treadaway and Ms. Foster, get together to consider, even on a without prejudice basis, those alternatives to the primary relief sort. Are you happy to do that?
So that's very helpful direction, and I'm very happy to go down that path. Yes.
I didn't want that to sound too glib, but I'd rather you know that now. Because
look, I fully appreciate where you're coming from as well. It does not sound glib or anything. It's very helpful direction.
Okay, thank you. Just on the upgrade thing, just before I hand over to anyone, is the term repowering synonymous with upgrade? Is it a subset of upgrade? I've been involved in wind farm consents such as Te Rere Hau, which was repowered, which essentially involved taking the 90 consented turbines and replacing them with 30 of a height that was 3 times the size of the original. Now that might be an extreme example of repowering because the Te Rere Hau wind farms with a small 2-bladed turbine. But as it generally is, when you're asking for provision for upgrades, are you really asking for repowering?
Question to answer, but you're right on the button that I mean the Te Rere Hau one is very much the situation that I explained that would apply to Haunui as well. Te Rere Hau, if I remember correctly, the 2-bladed turbines were 500 kilowatt turbines. The Haunui ones are, I think, 650 kilowatt turbines. If you're looking at a new wind farm, such as the one that Mercury Energy is just starting to build at Kaiwaikawe up north of Dargaville, they're looking at something like 4.5 megawatts. So, pretty much 10 times the size of the turbine. So as soon as you get into looking at some of the older wind farms, such as Tararua 1, you will be looking at a repowering situation. I'm not sure whether any part of Tararua is in this combined district area. I suspect it's a little bit north, it's Tararua district, but yes, repowering is certainly part of the agenda, but almost becomes a reconsenting project in its own right as well, because of the issues that you face. You identified with Te Rere Hau as, a whole lot less turbines, maybe over a bigger area. It becomes a new wind farm altogether, essentially.
Yes. So ultimately, whatever form ENG R6 takes, it would enable repowering to occur to whatever specified extent that rule.
That's what would need to be incorporated in those metrics or activity status that we're talking about, yes.
Oh, okay, understood. Thank you for that clarification. Just see if there's any other questions on the upgrading issue. Mr. Matthews, I also had a question on a network utility matter that you raised. It was, just find my notes. Yes, it was the non-complying activity status that would relate to not meeting standard NU.
It's radio frequency fields and electric fields, yes.
0.5, dealing with radio frequency and EMF. I just wondered whether you were still wanting to pursue that argument.
Look, It's more a matter of principle. I'm certainly not in a position where I would be saying somebody would want to set out and with an installation that exceeds those standards. The standards would apply. But what I'm concerned about is that there may be one minor incident or issue where you can't comply with the standard for a particular reason, but no one's actually affected by it. Why then would that be considered as a non-complying activity? Isn't that something that can be readily assessed as a discretionary activity, and whether you grant or decline the consent on that basis? It's just fundamentally, what does the non-complying activity status actually add to the assessment?
Yes, have you read the summary statement from Ms. Treadaway on that?
Actually,
She says, I consider that the non-compliant status is appropriate as any non-compliance with the standards, whether they're radio frequency fields or EM fields, can have a significant adverse effect on human health. And she's maintained that non-complying activity status is appropriate in that regard.
Except that's her viewpoint. As I say, that non-compliance with a standard that may adversely affect human health is equally a matter that could be considered for a discretionary activity consent. So that's the nature of my point. Is simply that, does the activity status actually change the assessment required or the consideration, or add anything to the consideration required?
Okay, on the basis that the rule must give effect to the policy, I'll just read you the policy, and that's requiring compliance with recognised standards and guidelines for the potential adverse effects of noise, vibration, radio frequency fields and electromagnetic fields. So the operative word is requiring compliance.
Yep. And that would still be the policy, yes.
You're saying that discretionary activity status would still give effect to that policy, could still give effect to that policy?
I believe so, yes. You would. Your starting point is compliance with the policy, but as we know, a policy isn't actually the rule. It's the policy. You don't comply with it, and use, for example, the noise part of that policy, require compliance with the noise rules. That doesn't automatically put you in non-compliance. Doesn't automatically put you into a non-complying status for noise.
Okay, that's interesting. I didn't have any further, but
We confirm was accepted those. These raised the definitions.
yes, we've got a question here from Commissioner Plymouth.
Yeah, Mr. Matthews, in your submission, you talked about the definition of maintenance and repair. And
Yes.
Mr. West made some changes. Have you seen those changes that he's made?
Was that this morning?
And
The
summary statement.
Summary statement. In his summary statement.
summary statement. So I'm not sure when the summary statement came through. There may have been a communication link between myself and Genesis on that one.
I think it was available last Thursday.
Yeah, that's through the hearing notes?
Yes, well, it's more than hearing notes. It's a formal document that the 42 officers try to deliver on the Thursday and Friday.
Yes.
Appreciate that. It's on the website, posted on.
Yes.
Could you have a look at that and come back to us and say that whether you accept or otherwise those recommendations?
I can do that this afternoon via the hearing administrator.
Thank you.
Mr. Matthews, is there anything else that you wanted to raise before we go to the next submitter?
Just at this stage.
Thank you for your time. You're welcome to stay online if you want. With the next submitter is someone that's known to you, I believe.
Thank you. Yes, I probably will stay online. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just close myself here. Everything that you but I had some reason for us. Yes. Thank you for turning up in person. That. Running about 30 minutes behind time.
Tēnā tātou katoa. Good afternoon, panel. My name is Christine Frosty. Previously, you know who I am. I have this written statement. I hadn't emailed it through to hear much of the question and answers this morning before finalising it, so it's very, very brief.
We noticed you came online, but belatedly.
Yes.
Yeah, so you probably missed a bit of the discussion.
They have done before, but from about 9:40 onwards, the adjournment.
We did yell out to you at one stage, but
I was on the phone. I do beg your pardon. You didn't have my underlying attention this morning. Yes.
Anyway, you're here now, and that's the main thing.
And I heard your clear direction, which is helpful and not surprising at all. And I'll read this brief statement, which lands perhaps in the same place. So starting at 1.2, Mr. Westmead has recommended to you in his last Thursday's summary statement amendments that align with amendments that I proposed in my statement of evidence, except in the following two respects. The first one is in relation to the maximum duration for placement of investigation masts. The plan limit is 5 years. Meridian requested 10. Mr. Wesney considers 10 years is too long for tall masts that may have adverse landscape effects. I take a different view because of my opinion that these masts are thin features in the landscape and are typically located in remote locations. For these reasons, I say they do not have material adverse effects. I've got some examples that I emailed through to Ruth.
Yes.
Just in support of my point, really, which is that I don't think that they have landscape effects full stop. Therefore, the duration of them makes no difference. I understand. I've checked in with Meridian about this. It's not actually a die in the ditch issue for them. Generally, their masts are in place for approximately 5 years, occasionally longer. My view that together with the other standards that are proposed, for example, height in relation to boundaries, that they naturally don't landscape. And really all it is the difference between, and there's probably a shelf full of them, Meridian having to go for consent for, 2 more years with the same effects one day, and the actual environmental effect of that being precisely nil. So this is the comments that I make are specifically in relation to this kind of mast. That's typical mast. I say they're thin in the landscape, and at distance they don't have any adverse effects at all, largely indiscernible. In other jurisdictions, we've settling on a rule that requires a distance from boundaries of X times the height, 3 times the height or whatever, just as a measure to ensure that it is genuinely remote. So that's just another factor that could be.
Really quick question. So on that really tall, skinny one, that does have a lot of lines coming off it as well to anchor it into.
3 guys, that's right.
So like
I can't see them.
Yeah, there.
45.
Yeah.
That mast you're looking at there is the Mount Munro.
That's Munro.
It's on the Anderson farm. It's very close to an operational agricultural airstrip. Which then poses a significant hazard for agricultural. Litigation that I'm constantly sure this does not become a extreme hazard for people.
I think that the chairman asked a question earlier about that, and I say there's a separate jurisdiction for that, which applies, and that the district plan itself shouldn't shouldn't duplicate that or attempt to replicate it. I think civil aviation is the right, appropriate jurisdiction to be concerned about those matters, both daytime flying and it's a hazardous activity, the kind of taking off and landing that happens for rural purposes. So it is important, but I think it's covered separately. Yeah.
We understand the issue. We're talking solely about the duration, not the
Yes.
rate or the
Right.
status.
No.
And the question for us is whether it's efficient and effective to limit the duration to 5 years, or should it be extended beyond that? You've suggested that it's not die in the ditch, but it would be preferable not to have to apply for an extension to the duration. To help us,
Efficiency issue.
yeah, to help us with that. In case you haven't already covered it, would it be possible to give us some indication of not just in the district, but in other districts, typical duration of these masts?
I would have to gather that together. I've got some anecdotal based on conversations last week. Yes, some evidence. Yeah.
And presumably the function of a meteorological mast is to get wind readings and over a sustained period of times to help the design of the wind, or to decide whether there was going to be a wind farm, and to help the design of it if there is. So what we need to understand is why more than 5 seasons of collection of that is necessary. Not 5 seasons, but 5 lots of 4 seasons.
Yeah.
Which goes to motivation to a degree, and I think your concern should be with what the effects are of them. But we can, and often, typically, they'll be removed because then there are meteorological pieces of equipment atop turbines, and you've got these things in place. So it's generally, and it costs money to maintain them. So generally, they disappear if something is actually built. Okay. Shall I move on to the next issue? Are there any questions around that? Okay. So the second issue of upgrading, the proposed plan assigns the same activity status, and that's discretionary activity, the establishment of new large-scale wind farms and the upgrading of existing wind farms. Meridian requested insertion of the permitted activity rule that you've read and don't favour. And Meridian's interest in this point is specifically about wind generation. It's not about solar in this regard. So the rule that Meridian's submission requested is based on an example from the proposed Waikato district plan, where they have coal. So they've embraced REG for their own reasons, and it was applied to a specific wind farm, and that's Te Uku, 26 turbine wind farm to the west of Hamilton, between the coast and Hamilton. The hearing panel in that case accepted a permitted activity rule of plus and a plus 40% height limit. Meridian sought a plus 50% limit and has been pursuing this through an appeal. So there are live discussions at the moment at mediation about whether it's 50% or 40%. And discussions are currently underway about a bespoke rule with a more refined height and locational standards specifically and only for the Te Uku wind farm. Mr. Wesney included a table listing the turbine heights and blade lengths for Castle Hill and Nui. Mr. Wesney's summary statement highlights an important point, and that is that an upgrading rule should only apply to existing established wind farms. Experience from Te Uku has demonstrated that a nuanced and bespoke set of standards is more appropriate than the standards presented in Meridian's proposed rule. It's my evidence that the PDP should provide a favourable activity status for the upgrading of established wind farms compared with the establishment de novo new wind farms on new sites. That is because the additional generation capacity achievable from upgrading equipment, and that goes to your point, Mr. Chairman, about is it repowering? I think the simple answer is yes in today's world. Upgrading equipment such as blades, it's efficient, and this is a relevant consideration under section 7B.
I imagine repairing is the worst case example of upgrade here. Yeah.
Most challenging, probably. Yeah. It's important, in my opinion, that the proposed plan includes provisions that contemplate upgrading such that the focus of any consent is on the impacts of any changes, rather than relitigating the authorised effects of the established wind farm. That is the essence of the point. So I would probably point to the example that the Chairman may be familiar with, which is Wellington City District Plan, where it's a balance between the sensitivity of the environment and the nature of the wind farm. Wellington City, you've got established large wind turbines and a known sensitive set of residential neighbours. Te Uku, very different. You've got there 26, a very rural location, very few sensitive activities nearby, and also both in the Wellington City, we're expecting this outcome, and in the Waikato situation, a rule that prevents sensitive activities such as dwellings locating as a permitted activity. They would need a consent to locate within a 40 dBA around the established wind farm. So that just protects before that. So the sensitivity aspect is managed in those situations. And for Wellington City, the starting point for upgrading is restricted discretionary activity, permitted activity, because the sensitivity is higher there. And I haven't had an opportunity to analyse the sensitivity of Wairarapa examples, the two authorised ones, and Mount Lando that's in the pipeline. Similar considerations would apply. So I talked with Meridian about it, and if the more efficient plan drafting approach is to start with an RDA, that provides a statement upgrading is contemplated with some standards that importantly create a baseline for comparison. And the first point of consideration should be much of Wellington set of rules at new effects of the old ones. So that's essentially a basis perhaps for discussing Matthews and any other party who may have an interest. That issue is responding to your invitation. And lastly, just a very small point before we come back to it. And in Mr. Wesney's summary statement, in policy, he may have covered this and I just didn't hear it today, ENG P4 at the end of what we call the chapeau. I think he has proposed deleting the word having, but I think you need it still. Having regard to. I think it's editorial. Chief.
Yes.
Which I should have emailed you about. I apologise.
Down here, yeah.
Small point.
I picked that up as well.
So happy to do it very quickly.
Don't delete the word.
Don't delete having.
Yeah.
Need it.
Properly.
Can I ask you a question? When you said existing wind farm, when do you suggest that a wind farm is existing? Is that once consent has been approved or once building has been completed?
I think the important thing for the purposes of looking at change or new effects is to look at what the authorised envelope of effects is. That will be established by the conditions of consent, and sometimes wind farms build up to that, sometimes slightly less. But what's important is what's the authorised envelope of effects, if you like.
That envelope includes things like heights, noise, and so on. So if we took Castle Hill, for example, which hasn't been constructed yet, entered, technology has obviously changed considerably since that process was started, and they've got a window of time till they have to construct, and otherwise the consent waves. I can't remember what the time is, but would you consider that if they changed to more modern technology, which included bigger towers, larger blades, that's an upgrade, or is that outside of the scope of the original consent?
It's what Meridian intends to be incorporated under the umbrella of upgrading. Yes. Yep.
Okay, so yes. So the thing doesn't need to be built to be upgraded.
Existing.
The consent's still alive.
It's got consent still live. Yes. Yeah.
So
Yeah, but
it's an upgrade to the consent.
Upgrading something physical, doesn't it? And at this stage, there's nothing physical to upgrade. There's literally a blank hill. So you're not upgrading anything, you're changing, aren't you?
Yes, I forget what the wording, whether we talk about existing, established. Would still be that the consent establishes a change in the environment that has to be accepted as part of the environment, and that the rule should apply to that. Yeah, built or not.
Yeah, but the application, the rules that are applied to that extent take into account the technology at the time, the application at the time, and therefore any upgrade may not, it's completely different technology, different sizes, different structures, the whole
Different effects.
different effects.
That's right. And they can come and go. Yes.
So that comes back to my question. If it hasn't been built, how could you say it's an upgrade, or would we have to treat that as a new consent?
I think it depends how you word a rule about upgrading.
Okay.
About whether
That's
about whether you use the expression established.
Yeah.
Yeah. Established. In other words, built.
That's something we need to mess up to finalise our position.
The other thing I'd just, in the course of, so two different approaches have been taken, for example, and for the Wellington City, where it's a consent, but it's at that RDA level. And for Tuku, we are going down the road of effectively almost looking at an application like a very bespoke, highly, to the point you're doing, sort of landscape assessment. And it's interesting. Landscape architects, the wiring diagram, what happens if you shift some 100 metres this way or that way and put plus discernible, and they agree not much. So the discussion at the moment is around perhaps having some more refined, nuanced rules about how many turbine tip or blades might be visible in the landscape from different perspectives. So it's quite detailed. That's the kind of assessment I would expect would be done through for example, restricted discretionary activity, focusing on what's the effective change.
The second part of this is you talked mainly about this is more bespoke for wind turbine or for wind farm, and yet nothing in the rules here say it's wind farm specific. So would you be suggesting that is it rule 6? Is it?
Yes.
6 should be a bespoke rule specifically for wind farms or for all renewable energy?
I have focused on wind, and the set of provisions that were advanced to you are just wind at this stage. So I haven't anything to give you that would be helpful in terms of, I don't understand what the implications of upgrading there are. So, and I've spoken with Meridian about this today. They're comfortable that it's confined to wind.
And I think it's important that the next group of submitters hear that, because otherwise they'll feel like they're caught on the hop in terms of the solar issue. So,
but unfortunately, simply not limited to wind.
No.
And so something we might need to, how we're going to.
Yeah, I'm going to attempt to try and summarise this now, if that helps.
I think it's just in the way the world has moved quite quickly since the time when submissions were lodged and further submissions, etc. But the focus was always intended to be wind.
Meridian Energy have lodged a submission to rule R6. R6 at the moment covers two activities: the establishment of large-scale renewable generation activities or the upgrade of existing large-scale renewable activities. So it's in two parts. Meridian have said that they're not challenging new large-scale renewable electric generation activities, as I understand it.
No.
They are suggesting an alternative activity status for the upgrade of existing. And the submission is lodged as permitted activity subject to listed standards 1 to 5, or really 1 to 4, because number 5 is features that would be excluded from the rule. We have that we don't have an appetite for the permitted activity with those particular metrics. The alternatives that we would like canvassed at conferencing would be either alternative metrics or with perhaps a slightly, perhaps not with a permitted activity status, but with controlled or restricted discretionary activity status, which would be an easier rule to draft, albeit that it would need to list out the matters of discretion that have been considered. The potential issues with the metrics are have you captured everything? For example, metrics are silent on noise, but noise may well also be captured by another rule that I'm unaware of in the district-wide rules. It may reference the New Zealand Wind Standard rule, for example, NZ 808, I think it is. Rule metric number 1, replacement of relocated structures within 100 metres of the existing location, is subject to debate because, as we heard today, wind farms are often consented with an envelope which allows movement of within 50 or 100 metres already. So is it 100 metres from the outer envelope, or is it from the originally identified spot in the middle of that envelope there? So all I'm saying is, and you know this already, Ms. Foster, is to be a permitted activity, and the level of prescription needs to be very precise.
Yes.
I just have some doubt about the ability to write a very robust permitted activity rule that is effectively meeting the policy, which is to manage the effects. I think we need to look at a consent of some sort to do that effectively, but perhaps less efficiently than a permitted activity status, but still effective in its own right. And certainly you could argue more effective than discretionary activity.
I think that the scope is there. If there's a spectrum from permitted that was requested and
the scope is definitely.
And I accept those points.
Yeah, a couple of other things that might help. The rule we've notified for the upgrade focus on existing. The word existing, both in R6, but also in the definition of upgrade.
Existing infrastructure.
Yeah, so whether existing includes consented but unimplemented, since I don't know, you might need to come back to us on that.
Like to think that through a bit more.
Yes, no, I don't want to put you on the sorry.
That's right.
And sorry, I'm going a bit fast here.
How's your shorthand?
Good.
And the idea of having the rule bespoke to wind farms as opposed to solar was something that the panel was very keen on seeing. Yep. So it would, what we're suggesting would see quite a significant rewrite of the rule, but within scope, because the scope, as you said, is very wide. It would involve Mr. Matthews, Mr. Wesney and yourself. But are there any other further submitters on this?
No, I don't think so.
That's right.
Not even the current Honui interests.
Right.
There, no.
Only other thing, and I don't, it's probably unfair to ask you, but I'm going to ask Mr. Wesney. Do we have a list, and you may have already done this, I missed it. Do we have a list of the consented and built and consented and unbuilt wind farms in the district?
Short list.
It's simple, isn't it? There's three on the book.
Built and two.
One actually built, one consented not built, and one not yet consented, but applied for waiting on Environment Court.
Third one being Mount Munro by Meridian.
Oh, okay.
Bottom end of.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's really just two that have been consented, one unbuilt, the other one in the pipeline. Okay. That's easy then. Maybe just for the record though, if you could just record that in your right of reply, Mr. Wesney.
Hasn't been talked about here, but there is a proposal in the Wairarapa that may well see fruition within the life of this plan, and that's the hydro scheme, that the water storage and potential hydro scheme that may go out the back of master. And how would the plan affect that?
Yeah. Well, that's where the bespoke wind farm rule. I mean, presumably,
Is that within scope?
you're not challenging. You would leave DA for solar and hydro as an upgrade for example.
Not sure what jurisdiction it would be over the hydro, but
Could you, well, yeah, if you could confirm that. at the moment. Yeah. Okay, anything else from Mr. Foster? Mr. Weston, any matters of clarification rising? Question?
Got a long list of.
Yep.
Matters.
Okay, I'm just conscious of time, so thank you, Mr. Foster.
Thank you.
Travels back over the hill. Hey, it's power. Cloud. And Miss, and we're just going to take a quick comfort break, Miss N, and we'll be back in 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Sorry, we're obviously running a little bit late, approximately 40 minutes, 55 minutes.